Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Michelle Nellenbach. I am the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and so thrilled you could join us. Apologies again for having had to reschedule this wonderful event, but glad we've got it back on the books. I'm also going to apologize in advance that I did test positive for COVID yesterday, so I'm going to try and keep sneezing and coughing to a minimum, but I apologize if that occurs once in a while. For those of you following and want to ask questions throughout the event, you can post them live into the chat on YouTube or on Twitter using hashtag BPC Live. So this is the first in our series previewing a potential Republican Congress. So as you all know, for the past 18 months, Democrats have established the national policy agenda with Republicans largely in reaction mode. Most pollsters and election experts believe that at a minimum, Republicans will retake the House with a chance to retake the Senate. This will give them the opportunity to set their own agenda and put forth policy ideas. So BPC is launching this series of events during which we will discuss with Republican and conservative thought leaders what they hope Congress will do and what they think they will actually do. Importantly, obviously, we will continue to have divided government. And throughout our history, divided governments have actually been quite productive as both sides recognize they have to deal to get anything done. And as a result, we've developed some really durable policy solutions. What we don't know going into next year is whether the occupants at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue will come to the table or just lock into no in hopes of gaining political advantage in 2024. Our hope at BPC is that both sides, recognizing the need to show some ability to govern, will identify a few areas on which they can work together. And history has shown there's a lot of them out there. So to lead off our series, I'm joined today by Dr. Yuval Levin, Senior Fellow of the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy, Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies, and Editor-in-Chief at the National Affairs with AEI. Welcome, Dr. Levin.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be with you.
So before we dive into the meat of today's discussion, I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about how you came from, you were a congressional staffer, a White House advisor, and now you have authored several books about society, institutions, and the government. So tell us about that career path and of course, what you're doing at AEI.
Well, sure. Thank you. I appreciate that. I was a young and kind of junior Hill rat to begin with. I worked on the House side, starting actually as a college student in Washington, D.C. And then after, I worked for a wonderful Republican member of Congress from New Jersey named Bob Franks. And he was a member of the Budget Committee. So after working for him for a bit, I worked for the Budget Committee. This is in the mid and late 90s, while John Kasich was chairman. One of those, as you say, very productive periods of divided government. There was a lot going on in the Budget Committee then around the budget deal of 97. And in the course of that process, actually, around the budget deal, I ended up going to work for Newt Gingrich while he was Speaker, the last 2 years of his speakership. I was a very junior staffer in his office. I worked for, I was an assistant to his legislative director. And when Newt left, I decided that it was time to deepen my education. And so I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, got a PhD there, and came back after a few years to work in the Bush administration. First, working for a presidential advisory committee on bioethics, which was chaired by one of my professors at the University of Chicago, Leon Cass. And then after a few years doing that, went to work at the White House on the domestic policy staff on some of the issues that I'd worked on the Hill, budget, healthcare, a few related things. And I was a domestic policy staff member at the White House for the entirety of George W. Bush's second term. And after that, I went to the think tank world. I worked for a number of years at a wonderful little conservative think tank called the Ethics and Public Policy Center. There, I also started the journal that I run, National Affairs. And in 2019, I moved to the American Enterprise Institute. So in all those places, I mean, really, the work that I do kind of sits at the intersection of theory and practice in politics. My PhD is really political theory, but a lot of the work I've done has been in public policy. And in one way or another, I try to look at the connection between the two, to work at that intersection of theory and practice and think about what underlies some of our policy debates, but also how political theory can be made more concrete by being guided by real policy needs and political realities.
Great. So you're exactly the person we need to be chatting with today. Excuse me. So today's polarization, and those of us living through it, certainly feels incredibly dire. Many people wonder if we as a nation are going to be able to come back together. But as you look through history, we've seen that there have been tough political spots for the country before. We have been divided before, and perhaps it's not quite as dire as we all think it is. Today's polarization does seem driven by the most recent news cycle. But in your first book, The Great Debate, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of the Right and Left, you describe how much older ideas are behind today's political divisions and how disagreements between 18th century thinkers like Burke and Paine parallel and underlay today's political visions. So setting aside everything we're debating today, what are the big philosophical divisions, serious issues about which thoughtful people may disagree between the division of left and right?
Yeah, that's a wonderful broad question. As you said, I mean, I think the intensity of polarization certainly varies in different times, and there are times when our politics feels much more divided, much less divided. But the shape of that division, I do think, has endured for quite a while. That first book you mentioned, which was an extension of my academic work, tried to think about what right and left are really about by looking at more or less the first iteration of a left-right debate at the end of the 18th century. Obviously, society's changed tremendously over 2 centuries, and I wouldn't want to suggest that the basic issues are still what they were 200 years ago. But I think that some of our deepest divisions actually reach down to a dispute almost about anthropology, about what the human person is, that is still very relevant. And at the heart of that kind of dispute, it is a question about how we understand the human being and his or her place in society. If you think that human beings are to begin with fallen, broken, sinful, prone to vice, however you want to put it, and in need of formation before we can really be free citizens, or whether you think people are born free, ready to be free, but are oppressed by various institutions in society, so that the problems of any society are really functions of abuses of power or of oppression of the weak by the strong. That basic dispute, that assumption, we all look out at a world that has a lot of good and bad in it, but where we begin, what we think is the nature of the problem, matters enormously. So if you think that people are born unprepared for freedom, but with the potential to be formed for it, then you tend to value the institutions of society that form people to be free. Family, community, educational institutions, professional institutions, ultimately political ones too. And you think that without those kinds of institutions, our society will tend to break down into chaos and disorder, so that the purpose of politics is to conserve, to reinforce those institutions that preserve the social order. If you think that, you're probably some kind of conservative. If you think that people are born free, but everywhere are mistreated by oppressive institutions, then you think that what's required of politics is more like liberation from oppression, and that to serve justice is fundamentally to rescue the weak from the strong, to address the implications, the effects of oppression. And so you think that the civilization that we've inherited is a product of various kinds of oppression throughout history, and our job is to break from that and to free and elevate the victims of it. If you think that, you're probably some kind of progressive. Now, there's some truth to both of those views, and a lot of people hold some combination of those views. But there's a lot to be gained, I think, by recognizing that, broadly speaking, people on the right very often look at the country's challenges in terms of order and disorder, civilization and chaos. People on the left often look at the same challenges in terms of oppressor and oppressed, or strong and weak. So very often when the left and right talk past each other on some of the most divisive issues of our time, it's because one side is thinking of them in terms of order and disorder. The other is thinking of them in terms of oppressor and oppressed. Think about our debates about crime, our debates about immigration, or a lot of other divisive issues. And you can see the usefulness of that kind of framework, because the two sides are really trying to solve for different problems. And ultimately, in order to break through that division, each has to see a little bit of what the other is getting at. That doesn't tell you everything you need to know about politics, but I think it's a helpful framework for thinking about why left and right so often kind of clumped together. People who agree with one another about education also happen to agree with one another often about immigration or about crime. Why is that? I think that does have to do with divisions and differences that run much deeper than the everyday issues that we're used to thinking about.
That's really a very helpful frame as we kind of try and figure out how we can bridge some of this huge divide and get people really talking to one another again, because it just doesn't seem to happen anymore. In your third book, you talk a lot about strengthening our institutions, from family to government, corporations and churches. And so I want to link that back to what you were just talking about in terms of how the institution can help overcome those philosophical differences. So can you explain how improved institutions would facilitate more civil discourse between people, in particular within Congress, which, as we know, is not quite functioning as well as it could be?
Yeah, that book, which is called A Time to Build, was published in 2020, and it really tries to explain some of the problems that our society faces by clarifying the idea of the institution, which we as Americans are not really used to thinking about, and showing how thinking institutionally could help us a little bit through the kinds of problems we have today. Institutions are ultimately frameworks for common action. They're the forms of common action. And so each institution in society is not just a bunch of people, it's a bunch of people organized around some shared goal or purpose, and it gives each of them a particular role in relation to that purpose and also in relation to one another. So from a family to a professional institution, a company or a school or a government institution, every institution allows us to turn a common goal into common action. And that emphasis on action, as opposed to just expression, for example, is one reason why thinking institutionally can help us now out of some of the particular challenges that we face today. In free and diverse societies, common action often means working together with people that you don't agree with about everything. You don't share a common worldview with. Maybe you disagree about guns and abortion and important issues, but you're still, say, all of you are nurses on the pediatric floor, right? So you work together all the time, deploying a kind of professional ethic that you share in common, even while you disagree about other things. And the institution, if it's strong and functional, allows you to do that by focusing you on its core purpose and by giving you a particular role to play in achieving that purpose. It allows for the kind of compartmentalization that lets you live with other people in a free society. Even in the political world, where political differences are obviously crucial, you still see strong institutions enabling that to happen. Members of a congressional committee of opposite parties obviously disagree with each other about a lot of things, but if it's working properly, the committee itself and its work directs them to accommodation and compromise by framing their work around a problem to be addressed. When our institutions are not working well, when they all just become platforms for individual expression, as we've seen happen in so many parts of American life, not only in politics, but in the corporate world and in American religion and in the academy, in journalism, then that kind of common action becomes much more difficult. Functional institutions let us work together without first agreeing about everything. And that's enormously important because we're never going to agree about everything. And so thinking institutionally, how do we strengthen the institutional core and ethic of Congress, for example, so that members of Congress understand themselves not only to be representing a divided society, but also to be constituting a single institution whose job it is to address that society's problems through accommodation and compromise. How do we help those members understand themselves as formed somehow by that institution is the kind of question we have to ask ourselves if we're thinking as reformers. And I think that's true, again, in American religion now, in the American academy, in a lot of the corporate world. We have to think about how do we get people out of a place where they think all they are individuals on a platform performing culture war animosities, which is so often what seems to be happening in American political life, and instead see that we also have institutional responsibilities that can let us work together, even though we live in a diverse and divided country. So thinking institutionally is one way forward in this kind of moment.
That's really insightful and helpful. I'm struck, though, by the fact you use the word compromise. And yes, being able to compromise for the institution, which ultimately is the America. It just doesn't feel like that's where the public wants decision makers to go. So for instance, you take Congress, the loudest voices, those who really don't want to compromise, seem to get all the attention. And so what's to be done to shore up? And I still think it's probably 90% of members of Congress are there to do the right thing. They want to be bipartisan. They want to work across the aisle. They want to find durable solutions for the country and are thinking of the institution, yet they are still being drowned out.
Yeah.
And I think one of the struggles we at BBC have had is how do we elevate that? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I'd say a few things. I think it's a very, very important challenge. It is the challenge for thinking about congressional reform in this moment. And it's important to see it that way because it's not obvious, right? As you say, members of Congress are not stupid and they're not crazy. They're answering to very, very powerful incentives, electoral incentives and broader cultural incentives that drive them now to accentuate differences, to focus on disagreement rather than to work together. And they feel like they pay a price for compromise and for accommodation, even though that's ultimately their job as members of Congress. And if we think about that situation in institutional terms, then the question becomes a little clearer, because one of the great strengths of the American system of government, and one of the things that actually distinguishes it from a lot of other democracies, is that it requires cross-partisan cooperation and bargaining in order to function. The US Congress is not like a European Parliament, where the majority party has all the power for some limited period of time. And while it's in power, it can do anything it wants, but it's answerable to the public and it gets thrown out if people are dissatisfied. Our Congress does not work that way. Even when there is a majority party, real action very often requires cross-partisan cooperation, and the structure of the institution forces compromise and accommodation. And yet, as you say, we live in a time now when that kind of cross-partisan accommodation is very, very difficult to achieve. So the question for reformers is, what are we trying to solve? Are we trying to help Congress need cooperation less, or are we trying to make cooperation more likely to happen? Those are two different ways of thinking about how to reform the institution. A lot of reformers, I think this is true especially on the left, and frankly, most reformers of Congress are on the left, now are in a place where they're thinking, how do we make cooperation less necessary, rather than how do we make it more likely? And so they think in terms of eliminating the filibuster, or in terms of empowering the majority party, empowering leadership, looking for ways to make Congress more efficient as a policy-making institution. But the other way of thinking about how to reform Congress is, how do we make compromise and accommodation more likely to happen? And it seems to me that that's the right way to think about how to reform the institution. It's the Madisonian way to think about how to reform it, because ultimately we need Congress to be that arena for compromise and accommodation. It is, in fact, the only arena for cross-partisan accommodation in our system of government. And this is a vast, diverse democracy. It's a place where we're always going to have a lot of differences. And so the question for reformers ought to be, even in this divided moment, how do you make cross-partisan cooperation more likely? I think that means thinking in terms of strengthening the committee system rather than the leadership. It means thinking in terms of some electoral reforms that change those incentives that members face. 10 or 15 years ago, I would have dismissed ranked choice voting as a kind of gimmick, as just, some clever idea that people want to play with in universities. But I now think ranked choice voting, given where we are, given the power of the primary system, is an experiment that needs to be tried. Creating the incentive for people to be everybody's second choice might be one way to change the incentives that members face when they're in Congress. I think we have to think about changes to the budget process, maybe even something as radical as combining authorization and appropriation, so that the work that members do matters and they're firing with real bullets, so that rather than thinking of themselves as performers, as sitting in a committee hearing, looking at a camera and producing YouTube clips, which is basically a lot of how committee hearings work now, they have to think, we're making legislation. We're actually doing the real work of policymaking here. And that can recreate those incentives for some cross-partisan accommodation. But broadly speaking, I think in asking ourselves, how do we reform the institution, the question ought to be, how do we make that kind of bargaining more likely, rather than how do we make it less necessary?
Excellent. Yep. Totally, completely agree. Especially, you look at the budget process. It should be one of the most important functions they do, yet it really is a partisan exercise with little to no collaboration at all. And we barely ever get appropriations bills done anymore. So a
Yep.
lot of that could be improved if we could just
I mean, the budget
reframe
process
things.
has become an outright menace.
It's
It's a process designed in the mid-70s for a Congress that both parties assumed would always be run by one party, by the Democrats. And it was designed to enable the minority party to have some input into that process, but ultimately to let the majority run it. And we've now been in 30 years of a Congress that switches back and forth, and the budget process has become a means for messaging. I mean, it lets each party put forward a kind of dream bill that's never going to go anywhere, and then talk about how the other party is keeping good things from happening, rather than be a process that compels cross-partisan work. And it can change. I mean, we don't have to live with this process. Members that don't like it can change it. But I'll tell you, I mean, you know this better than I do, but in talking to members about that, the idea that they could even change how the budget process works is news to a lot of members. And I think we have to get to a place where reform is a real option.
It's a really good point about, it seems that control of the Congress is always, it's always flipping back and forth. It's always within reach. And so we do have to rethink how we approach reform and some of these processes we established so long ago to reflect the fact that the elections are going to switch control, and we've got to find durable ways to hold the institution together, regardless of who's in charge and regardless of the fact that it's going to flip back and forth. I want to look a little bit more about conservatives and how they're going to approach this divided government and the potential for Republicans to retake at least the House. So you have written another book, this one back in 2016, The Fractured Republic: Renewing America's Social Contract in the Age of Individualism. And you call on conservatives to enter into the details of public policy debates and not limit themselves to a level of abstraction. How well do you think conservatives have responded to that call? And what are the policy realms in which conservatives have contributed the most compelling ideas in the last 5 years? And what do you think they're going to look for Congress to do in the next year or two?
Yeah. Well, how well? Not very well. I mean, look, I work at a think tank, at a public policy research institution, and the work that we do aims to advance that cause of getting particularly politicians on the right, in the case of AI, to engage more in the nuts and bolts of public policy. Our scholars, and at similar research institutions on the left and the right, various scholars, including BPC, of course, can help politicians do that much more effectively. But in the last few years, members of Congress have been a lot more inclined to use Congress as a platform to elevate their profiles as individuals, to build their brand, to build their social media following in that big, largely symbolic kind of set of battles that we call the culture war. And frankly, that's been particularly true on the right. That doesn't mean that there haven't been any policy ideas worthwhile on the right. I think that we've seen some advances in how Republicans think about family policy. Mitt Romney has been a leader on that front. I think some Republican politicians have tried to develop ideas in the realm of governing the tech sector and thinking about that new arena of American life. There have been some good ideas for expanding the reach of educational choice for parents, a traditional area of interest for conservatives. And of course, beyond the politicians in the think tank world, there's been a lot of work on some very important areas: higher ed financing, on housing, on healthcare, on school reform. But think tank scholars do that for a living. The challenge you're asking about is among the politicians, and I think it is still very much the case that Republican politicians don't enter enough into the details of public policy, don't often enough think of themselves as reformers. And that leaves them less able to offer their voters real solutions to the kinds of problems they face. I mean, right now, Republicans are running on how terrible inflation is, for example, and how badly the Democrats are responding to it. But what's their alternative? What's the Republican approach to taming inflation? You'd think that would be, at the front of what every Republican says to voters. I don't think a lot of voters could tell you what Republicans would do about inflation. And I don't think a lot of Republican politicians could tell you either. So I do think it's necessary, especially if they're going to be the majority party in the next Congress, and certainly at least in the House, that's very likely, to think in practical terms about some discrete set of issues. But the the enticing approach for Republicans, and it's this way for Democrats too, very often, especially when they're in the minority, is to think in terms of messaging, to think about how to box the other party into a place where it's in an uncomfortable position with voters. And exactly because, as we've just discussed, control of Congress flips back and forth all the time. Neither party really has a strong incentive to think longer term about legislating and policymaking. And I think Republicans have fallen into that trap even more than the Democrats, and need to do much better in thinking concretely about a policy agenda.
So that was going to be one of my questions. What do you think they might do on some of those issues? In particular, so BPC is particularly interested in addressing economic inequality, and the rise in inflation and the supply chain issues have all kind of have highlighted just those disparities. We've particularly been interested in the racial wealth gap. So I'm just curious, like, what does economic inequality mean? Does it mean income inequality, wealth inequality? When conservatives and conservative voters think about the problem of inequality, how are they understanding that problem? And if Republicans really want to tackle this, what are the couple things that you'd suggest they start off with?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the tendency of conservatives is to think that inequality above all is a lack of opportunity, so that the solutions to it look like means of expanding opportunity, ways of better growing the economy, of connecting people to better educational and employment options, supporting people's desires to form families and communities, and ultimately having government serve a supporting role rather than play a leading role in the American economy. And that's fundamentally because we as conservatives tend to think that inequality is a kind of second order problem. It's what you see when too many people lack opportunities to build a flourishing life. And that lack of opportunity is the real problem. You can't address it by just reducing inequality, which you could do just as easily by lowering the top as by raising the bottom. The top is not the problem. Wealth is not a social problem. Poverty is a social problem. And so the challenge is ultimately about enabling greater mobility out of poverty rather than just closing gaps, so that when conservatives start talking about inequality, pretty soon we end up talking about mobility. This is my own view very much too. It connects, frankly, to what we talked about before. I think a lot of progressives, broadly speaking, and I'm painting with a broad brush, tend to look at society and see patterns of oppressor and oppressed. And so in looking at the enormous inequalities in our society, and they are enormous and require our attention, they tend to ask who is abusing whom, who's oppressing whom, who's the weak and who's the strong, and see great wealth and extreme wealth inequalities as evidence of injustice. Conservatives tend to look at the same situation and see social disorder and breakdown, leaving too many Americans falling behind and unable to benefit from the enormous opportunity that our society can offer. And so we tend to want to help those fellow Americans by helping them have more access to opportunities. So conservatives quickly will end up talking about school choice for better education, about an approach to welfare that encourages work and marriage, which are essential ways out of poverty, talking about equalizing economic opportunities more than economic outcomes. So I think if you see a Republican Congress next year taking up these kinds of issues of inequality, it will very likely be in terms of improving opportunity, and so of education reform, of various forms of welfare reform, rather than thinking explicitly or directly in terms of inequality as such.
Very helpful. So one other issue that you mentioned, welfare reform. Obviously, 1996, the Welfare Reform Act was a big experiment where Congress gave states authority over those programs through basically a block grant. And so you're looking at the Roe decision that's likely to come out of the Supreme Court in the next couple of weeks, which would could, if it goes the way the leaked draft was, push those decisions down to the state government. Yeah. Republicans have largely been the party of state rights. It obviously depends in many ways on the specific issue. But if you're looking at a Republican Congress, what does that renewed federalism look like? To your point around equality, is it incentives to states? Is it just, or more of a hands-off approach, which is, this is not the job of the federal government, we're going to leave it to the states? What does it look like? And are we going to see a renewed push on federalism from the Republicans.
Yeah, I do think so. And, I think in some ways this relates to the very fundamental points we started with, which is I think conservatives tend to think about the nature of social problems by starting from the bottom and working up, by thinking about how individuals and families and communities flourish, and thinking about building social order, which very often happens from the bottom up. And so the role that the federal government can play is a supportive role, providing resources, and providing some means of enabling those more local institutions to address problems. The welfare reform of '96, which was a compromise, but was really shaped by Republicans newly empowered in Congress, worked, for example, by enabling states to basically set their own path toward achieving a set of goals that were set up by the federal government. But how to get there was up to states. And very often the states did that by empowering civil society institutions, by empowering local institutions to provide help to people who were also getting financial assistance. I think that's an example of how conservatives tend to think about how government can play a role in solving problems. And so it does seem to me that if Republicans are in a place to make policy, and obviously even if they win control of both houses, it's still divided government. The Senate will be closely divided either way, and they have to think about how to get things signed by a Democratic president. But I think the tendency will be looking, for example, at education policy, to think in terms of empowering states to offer people more options, more choices. Similarly, in welfare or in family policy, the approach would be to think about how to enable a greater diversity of experimentation. I think Republicans will want to take up some action around crime and law and order, but again, by enabling local communities, local police forces to have more resources and more options. You can think, for example, about the deal around gun control that's just been announced this weekend, where if you look individually at a lot of the specific steps they've agreed to take, a lot of those show that the place where there can be some agreement, it involves enabling local and state authorities to take steps that they otherwise might not have the resources to take. So red flag laws, which a lot of Republicans and Democrats support, in that agreement are not going to be federal laws, but the federal government is going to provide incentives and financial support for states to enact and implement red flag laws. I think you'd see that happening in a lot of areas if Republicans have their way. And it just tends to be the nature of their approach to public policy. And so, it's not a coincidence that that's also where a lot of conservatives think the locus of abortion regulation should be, is at the state level. And it seems to me that if you see conservatives in the House or in Congress advancing policy ideas, a lot of those would look like enabling federalism and a diversity of experimentation with different kinds of policy options.
Great. So I do I'm going to be asked one more question, but then just a reminder for our audience, you can ask questions through YouTube or on Twitter using hashtag BPC Live. So as you mentioned, regardless of what happens, there's still a Democrat in the White House, so it's divided government. What are the issues you think they can work together on?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, I think that the answer to that really has to start with what are the issues that are on voters' minds. And so in a sense, the issues that they feel like they have to do something about. And first and foremost of those is the broad slate of cost of living issues, inflation and rising costs in various areas. And it's not easy to see what compromise legislation looks like there. Frankly, it's not easy to see what any legislation looks like there. A lot of that is in the hands of the Fed. The Republicans are generally the first to say so, and so are not going to be inclined to dramatic action to reduce costs in various areas. But if you think about the places where energy costs are focused, where cost of living is focused, it's energy, it's food costs, it's housing and healthcare. Those are areas where the federal government plays some role in driving costs up. I think you might see a move to suspend or reduce the federal gas tax. You might see a move to try to reduce some of the regulatory barriers to competition in some of the areas where the federal government drives up costs, in healthcare, for example, to some degree, maybe even in higher education. But the core cost of living issues are not amenable to easy legislative solutions. And I think you're going to see a lot of talk and a lot of accusations across the aisle on those issues, but probably not a lot of legislation. On crime, we may see some action because crime is an area where, again, it's possible to operate by empowering local authorities and giving them options. And it may be that there's room for compromise there. And actually, President Biden has real experience on that front as a legislator himself in advancing ideas that did win a lot of Republican support in the 1990s. And maybe there's some room on that front to think about that. I think that there may be room for compromise on family policy. I mentioned before quickly Mitt Romney's child benefit proposal, which actually won a lot of support from, well, maybe not a lot. It won some support from Democrats as well as from Republicans. And I think it might be an area where you could think about a reform or transformation of the child tax credit along the lines that he proposed. Maybe there's room for some clever bargains in other areas. You know, Romney, together with Tom Cotton last year, proposed requiring E-Verify of most employers with an increase in the minimum wage. And I think it's imaginable that you could get some Democrats to support that kind of idea. I think it's very imaginable that President Biden could support that. And you'd see a little bit of progress at the margins, therefore, on immigration, as well as an indexing of the minimum wage to inflation, which right now would amount to a very significant minimum wage increase. Maybe that's much too hopeful, but I think those are areas where you can at least imagine some action, some attempts to reach across the aisle, because ultimately that is really the only way to get any legislation passed in a moment of divided government. But, you know, you're also going to see a lot of posturing and a lot of messaging bills where Republicans just try to put Democrats in a tough place looking to 2024. It's hard to avoid thinking that that's a lot of what a Republican Congress would end up doing.
Thank you for that. So we've got a couple questions, mainly and I think you actually addressed much of it just now in terms of how will Republicans appeal? And truthfully, I think it's a problem on both sides, where again, you have primaries. Members are mostly concerned about their primaries and being challenged from the left or the right. And so they are appealing to the base. How do we get them to more appeal to the middle, reach out to members from the other side? You had just noted a couple different ways in which Republicans could work with the Biden administration. Those are policies that hopefully would appeal to a broad section of both parties. One question in particular is your thoughts about primaries leading towards more extreme candidates on either side, and what are we to do about that other than redistricting reform?
I mean, look, I think primaries were a terrible mistake, and it probably wasn't obvious in the 70s when both parties adopted them. I mean, the parties were using primaries to some degree starting as early as the 1920s, but binding primaries for choosing candidates for Congress really only began in the 1970s. The reason for it was to democratize the process of candidate selection. You can see the argument. But in retrospect, it is really clear that primaries have contributed enormously to the intensifying of polarization and to the way in which our politics now appeals to the margins of both parties rather than to the broad middle of the country. And yet, it's very hard to imagine the parties backing away from primaries. You just can't quite imagine the politician making the argument that we need to have candidates chosen by some committee of the party and not by you, the voters. That's not going to happen. So I think we have to think about how to move forward from the situation we're in now. To me, that's one reason to think about some electoral reforms like ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting in candidate selection has a lot of promise because it creates a situation where candidates have a strong incentive to want to be everybody's second choice, as well as some people's first choice. And that right there creates a kind of incentive for a candidate who's inclined to appeal more broadly than just one narrow segment of his or her own party. There's some experimentation going on with that. Alaska, for example, is experimenting with ranked choice voting this year, not only in its one House race or its two, or one of its Senate races, which are up this year, but for its entire state legislature. And we're going to see what ranked choice voting looks like as a way to populate a state legislature. And we'll learn a lot from that. And it may be that that becomes an argument for a kind of electoral reform that can help us deal with the implications of the primary system. I think some reforms of that sort are necessary. Empowering the parties to play more of a role in candidate selection and moving away from the kind of open primaries that have led us to this place is important. There are also surely some institutional reforms of Congress that can help to, again, create incentives for members to want to engage in legislative work rather than to engage in pure messaging. Legislative work has to be compromise work. And so if they have an incentive to do that, then they have an incentive to reach across to some part of the other party. And I think thinking through what happened, giving committees control of floor time, for example, as is done in the state legislature in my home state in Maryland, turns out to be an enormously powerful way to make committee work matter. If the committees know that if they pass a bill out of committee with some votes from both parties, then they will get a floor vote on that bill, then members know they're firing with real bullets, the work matters, and dealing with one another becomes much more attractive. I think we've got to think concretely that way as reformers of the institution about how to change incentives.
That's really interesting. We have a couple of different congressional reform proposals. I had not heard the one about giving committees more control over the floor time. I think that's really interesting because oftentimes they pass bills and they sit there in part.
Yeah.
And this kind of goes to one of the questions we got from the chat is that particularly in the Senate, your challenge is you can get a bill to the floor, but how do you get it off the floor?
Right.
And so there is a desire by leadership to control that process because with the filibuster rules as they are, you can get a bill to the floor and it's stuck there for weeks. And so one question we had from the chat is, as opposed to eliminating the filibuster, which I will admit as a 13-year veteran of the Senate, I am not in favor of. Are there reforms? There's a lot of talk about you shouldn't be able to filibuster the motion to proceed. Are there other ways to minimize its use so it's not just this vehicle to block things?
Yeah, I don't want to repeal the filibuster either. I think it plays a very important part in enabling what little cross-partisan accommodation and deal-making we do have. And we see that now in the Senate around the deal around guns. We saw it with the infrastructure bill. I think it's important. But the filibuster is certainly overused. And I think we do have to think about ways to make it harder to deploy so that it happens only around some significant issues and not on every bill. And so the ideas you mentioned, I certainly agree with. I do think that the filibuster on a motion to proceed is not necessary and is not a good idea. I think that moving in the direction of some kind of talking filibuster has some promise, but there's a way that actually would create more of a problem and hold up the Senate more if you couldn't do the kind of dual tracking that's done now, where bills can still move while a different bill is being filibustered. Just think about what that would look like. If you don't think that Ted Cruz can just talk for 3 weeks straight to stop the Democrats from doing whatever they want, then you don't know Ted Cruz. I think there are Democrats like that as well. And so we have to think about ultimately what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve a Senate that is functional, that can move legislation, but also that requires some cross-partisan accommodation, and some form of the filibuster I do think is necessary. Some form of supermajority requirement is necessary in order to enable that. But we have to think about the design and structure of it in a way that takes account of the purpose of that Senate institution now. And the purpose is to force the parties to deal with each other. I think we have to think about reforms in general in terms of how do we make it more likely that the parties will reach across to one another and legislate together.
Well, thank you. I'm going to let that be our final point. We are at time. So thank you all to our audience. And thank you, Dr. Levin, for participating. I hope the Republicans on the Hill hear what you said. You gave some really good ideas on how they can work with the other side going forward. So again, this was the first in our series. Please watch BPC's website for more. And thank you all for participating.
Thanks very much.